Sustainable productivity has quadrupled from that time to an estimated 175% of the total available, which means that at the end of July each year, we've used up globally all of the sustainable productivity that's available to us, and we're eating into the future. We are farming at the present time, or grazing, an estimated 40% of the Earth's land surface, more about that later, and affect in one way or another every square centimeter of the rest. The use of synthetic pesticides has exploded since our butterfly rearing days into a major industry and has obviously negatively affecting biodiversity outside of the fields where it's used, when it's used properly. For Mexico, Ceballos has shown that about 60% of the populations of mammals that were there in 1950 are no longer there. Only about 40% of all the populations of mammals that were in Mexico in 1950 have survived. One of the most impressive points is that while human beings and our domestic animals constitute about are only a few species, we together constitute about 95% of all the mammalian biodiversity on Earth, and all the wild mammals put together constitute about 5%. Many of the places that Dan and I visited and found so much rich biodiversity in the 1950s and 60s in Costa Rica, Colombia, and elsewhere have been clear-cut. For example, Rincon de Osa or San Vito de Java, which were very rich places in biodiversity in the 60s when OTS was just getting started. At the Missouri Botanical Garden, we have a worldwide effort to collect plants and to catalog them and to understand them and save them while they're still there. Those people on our staff who've been looking at plants for 40 or 50 years in Latin America, such as Tom Crowett or Doug Stevens, tell me that not one of the places where they got their plants is still there in the same condition that it was when they collected them. And of course, I can certainly say the same for the places, for example, in Costa Rica where I collected when Dan and I were both down there, which are now clear cut. And when I got there, I was getting new species of trees and all kinds of wonderful things. So given all of that, how could anybody possibly believe that the numbers of insects are not falling rapidly? If the numbers of insects were not falling rapidly, it would have to be because you entomologists have a special kind of voodoo that somehow keeps them going. There's certainly no possible way that all the things that I've just outlined could leave room for a maintenance of the same number and diversity of insects as there were then. And that's 1950s, let's say, or 50 years ago. And what that means is that it's very important to do as much as possible of the careful measurement work that's been described so elegantly in a couple of the preceding papers. But it's also important to remember that, as Dan Jansen has wisely told us, this is the time for a fire hose if we want to really be able to stop the fire, reverse it, and save a reasonable proportion of the biodiversity that occurs on this globe with us. We're about 7.7 billion people now. We're adding about 200,000 people a day, so that by 7.7 billion now, in 30 years by mid-century, there will be a net increase of 2.2 and we'll have billion people, and we will add about 200,000 a day added to the present population. But in the present population, as I'll mention a little more in a minute, we have many people starving. We have great social inequities with about 10% of the people living in nations that use a very high proportion of the global productivity, and the majority of people living in nations from which we're drawing much of what we use to support our own greed and outrageously high standards of living, which in any case can't be supported on a global basis. If everybody in the world was consuming like we do in Europe and the United States, it would take about 4 to 5 planets Earth to support them. We haven't got that, and you think about the other end of that teeter-totter and realize that the world is made up largely of very poor nations which have very few options. In global climate change, the temperature is clearly warming. There are people who will still argue, God knows why, that it's not warming, even though the measurements and everything are there, perfectly well documented. 99% of the scientists in the world and all of the scientific bodies in the world agree with it. And what we do is generally putz around and make inadequate efforts to stop it. Many people think that we may reach 1.5 degrees Celsius within 10 years or so, and 2 degrees Celsius, which is supposed to be the other side of the red line, by mid-century. Certainly nothing we've done so far promises anything much better than that. Now let's turn and talk about human populations on Earth. Our species, Homo sapiens, is at least 300,000 years old. It originated in Africa, came to Eurasia, at least with the major expansion to Eurasia. There are some indications now of earlier invasions into Eurasia, about 70,000 years ago. Once our ancestors got to Eurasia, they spread very rapidly to Australia, becoming the first human beings to live in Australia, and more slowly to North and South America, no less than 15,000 years ago, but with a great deal of controversy on whether it could have been much before. About 11,000 years ago, presumably in Western Eurasia, presumably in Western Asia, Southwestern Asia, our ancestors for the first time developed crop agriculture and the practice of domesticating animals for food. At that time, when agriculture was developed, the hunter-gatherers who inhabited the world then amounted to a total of about 1 million people. About 11,000 years ago, like 400 generations, about a third of the number that live in St. Louis at the present time. And at that time, 11,000 years ago, the population of Europe consisted of about 100,000 people. Those people were basically swamped out by agricultural invaders from Asia who brought agriculture into the fertile soils of Europe for the first time then. As people had a supply of food to last over the unfavorable seasons, they began to build villages and towns and cities, and their population began to grow rapidly, and they didn't have to wander around constantly seeking food, so they could afford, so to speak, to specialize in certain ways of living, in being religious teachers, in being poets, in being musicians, in being government officials, whatever. And in doing so, they eventually developed writing in about 3 different centers about 5,000 years ago. And by about 3,000 years ago, we're now starting to understand human beings had already transformed large stretches of the planet. By 3,000 years ago, I can remember hearing a lecture by René Dubos once that said Greece did not receive its essential character until its hills had been denuded and it began to look like Greece does now. And I reacted badly to that at the time, but I know now exactly what he meant. In Mediterranean region of Europe, the Near East, and North Africa, which has been the most heavily hammered by human beings of any traditional agricultural region, imagine how many species must have gone extinct along the way that haven't even come close to getting up to the era where anybody gave a darn about them. By the time of the Roman Empire, there were about 200 million people, about 80 million in Rome, about half of them slaves. By 500 years ago, at the interface between medieval times and the Renaissance, there were about 500 million people, 1 billion in Napoleonic times, 2 billion in the 1920s, and on to 7.7 from the 1920s to today. Scheduled to reach nearly 10 billion, as I said, 30 years from now. One reference that I recommend to all of you is a Global Footprint Network, which is a careful calculation by Mathis Wackernagel and his colleagues of the amount of sustainable productivity that we consume. He runs this for the whole world and for every individual nation, and also includes in his website formulas for how you can calculate how much you consume in your own family or community or whatever. A number of governments throughout the world, certainly not the United States, are taking this very seriously and beginning to build it into their policies. When we consider then what the effect of all of this is on biodiversity, let's start by saying, how many are there? Well, we've described about maybe 2 million species by the present time. When I first worked on a committee for future planning for systematic and evolutionary biology in the 70s with Dan and others involved in it, the estimate was that there were about 1.5 million species of eukaryotes in the world, and probably and probably 2,000 in all. But when we got into thinking about tropical biology, it seemed a bit strange that in the 150,000, only 50,000 were in the tropics, and 100,000 were in temperate regions, and yet in the groups we were studying, there was twice or more as much diversity in tropical regions as in temperate regions. When you figure that groups like fungi, mites, and nematodes among eukaryotes are essentially unknown, then Dan Jansen's recent estimate of 20 million species, if not other estimates of larger numbers, begin to make sense. If you want to estimate the rate of extinction, one of the ways you can do it is look at hard-bodied fossils like mammals and mollusks in the fossil record and see how often they go extinct, and then see what the rates of extinction look like now. By doing that with various colleagues, we've come to calculate that about 1,000 times as many species per unit time are becoming extinct now as has been the case during the whole tertiary period. If you then turn around and look at the registers made by conservation groups like IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, you could pretty readily come to the conclusion that about 20% of the species on Earth are at risk now, and as many as half of them could be at risk by the end of the century. Since we depend entirely on biodiversity, both directly for our food, our medicines, and what have you, most of our medicines and what have you, and since we depend on the functioning of ecosystems for the maintenance of our atmospheres, our waters, and for preventing erosion, the loss of so many of the individual species that make up those ecosystems is the most serious thing that's happened to us, or as Ed Wilson put it, the sin for which our descendants are least likely to forgive us. We just don't know at what point the subtraction of individual species from ecosystems will endanger those ecosystems and cause them to collapse. But certainly with global warming ripping along at the speed that it is, we can look for and worry about collapse a lot sooner than we would want to. With the start of the Industrial Revolution in about 1760, we had wood providing the primary fuel, but then of course we turned to the coal and oil and things that really began to change the character of our atmosphere. In the United States, we've seen a decrease, about a third less forested land than there was when people got going here seriously in about 1630. But in the tropics, we see a much faster loss of land. Since the Convention on Biological Diversity was ratified in 1992, 26 years, about a quarter of all tropical lowland forest has been cut. And while we look for remissions in that in individual countries, it's not altogether clear how that's going to come about, since if we don't preserve it, it's gone, and it's gone permanently. Tropical forest is being lost incredibly rapidly, and most people estimate that the forests in Africa, the tropical moist forests in Africa, the tropical moist forests in Southeast Asia will certainly be gone by the end of this century. Whether that's true in Latin America or not remains to be seen. Latin America has taken some proactive steps that are beginning to show. Now, when you talk about agriculture and how to preserve biodiversity while practicing the agriculture that we need to feed 3 times as many people as we had during my lifetime, we see that intensive agriculture is logical because it can grow food, and by growing food well, it can save a lot of the other land for biodiversity, so to speak, or for supporting services like pollination. Unfortunately, and I was reminded of this thought by the excellent lecture on biodiversity, insect diversity in Germany, when you get down to small areas, what comes into play is the rule of island biogeography that was worked out so well some decades ago. Species gradually get lost in small areas, so the smaller the little pieces of biodiversity we have around our fields, the more likely that they'll be lost. That is simply a matter of statistics. Small populations tend to come and go. Certainly as a native of California, which had 6 million people when I was born and now has 40 million people in an economy larger than Great Britain's, those little fragments of biodiversity have lost a great deal of what was there when I was there, including the insects, the Jerusalem crickets, tenebrionid beetles, earwigs, and what have you, were in my own backyard, which was a house built on the sand dunes of San Francisco. The trade-off is always going to be between food need and saving biodiversity, or saving as much natural vegetation as possible for the reasons that have been brought out very clearly before. In theory, parks and reserves are the way to do it, but with the gross inequity between nations, about 10% of which control about, the great proportion of the world's wealth, and the difficulty for poorer nations, and Costa Rica is kind of intermediate in that respect and receives a lot of foreign attention, which gives it a power. But the difference between poorer nations, like the 20 poorest nations in the world, think Haiti and Upper Gambia and so forth, and what they can do about preserving their biodiversity will depend very much on a new attitude on our part. In fact, I would go a little deeper and say that in order to hold this whole thing together, the world is going to have to make some very fundamental changes. 8 people in the world have as much wealth as the 3.6 billion poorest people in the world, for example. And there's unrest in much of Latin America right now because of that kind of social inequity. In order for us to conserve the world sustainably, and insects are a major part of that, we're going to have to find new ways to be kind to one another and to love one another. We're also going to have to find ways to bring the world population back into some reasonable limit. Hardly anyone who's ever looked at the situation thinks the world can accommodate more than about 2 billion people, 3 billion people on the long run. But when that's brought up, people usually ridicule them and say, well, it's all a matter of consumption. One of my friends once said, if it was all a matter of consumption, that's like saying if you could teach the lions in the zoo to eat grass, there'd be a lot more room for lions. People are greedy, they're selfish, They're conservative. In getting on with this, we're going to have to bring down our consumption. The whole world can't consume at the level of the United States just because they want to do it, and just because we offer it as kind of a false target for them. There just isn't enough here. There's no possibility of producing enough for them to do that. The empowerment of women worldwide is extremely important in bringing about a sustainable world. About 1 billion women and children in the world have no say at all in their own societies. And if the original motto of the United Negro College Fund was, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste," what do you think about wasting 1 billion of them just by having habits that say that women don't really have any rights? We've got to work on that very hard, even in the United States. We've got to work on internal justice, but basically we've got to work on worldwide social justice, or nobody's going to have the leverage to do all the fancy things we think about. There are probably at least 10 million species of insects or more. They are going down the drain rapidly. They're going down the drain rapidly because we have, for instance, 98% of all the mammalian biomass in our control, and we affect the whole Earth, and we have 40% of the Earth cultivated. Insects can't come to the table. We need to get there and defend them. They play integral parts in all ecosystems, most of which are very poorly known at present, and which we have very little chance of knowing well before they disappear permanently. It's up to you, who think about insects every day, to find ways to reverse the trends that we're talking about here today, trends that we carry out and on which we often don't connect the dots. I was interested that yesterday our president said he was going to force China to accept $20 billion worth of agricultural products. And somebody said, that was what the Farm Bureau asked, and somebody said, no, they have to accept $50 billion of agricultural products. And the Farm Bureau said, well, no, that's impossible to produce on the land in the United States. And he said, well, make them get bigger tractors. Make them get bigger tractors is about what's wrong with the world now. I hope that what I've said will give some insights into some angles of this terrible dilemma that may inspire you. I hate to think that my young granddaughter will be, when she's my age, it'll be the year 2102. What it's like in 2102 will depend entirely on us and our children. So I would conclude by saying, let's get busy.